on 16 August in 2012, members of the South African Police Service shot 34 miners in cold blood during a tragic week that claimed 44 lives. The workers were on a strike, demanding that their monthly salaries be increased to 12,500 rand. Many were shot in the back with military assault rifles. It remains the bloodiest massacre in post-apartheid South Africa. Joining us now to reflect on the disaster is Newzroom Afrika's editor, Gia Nicolaides, who witnessed the developments as they took place on that fateful day 9 years ago. Gia, good morning. Great to speak to you. Just put into perspective for us what that day was like. How did events unfold?
Well, Hugo, I think it was a day that nobody expected. What happened prior to the 16th of August was that there was an unprotected strike in Marikana. Mine workers were unhappy with regards to the amount that they were being paid. We didn't know that at the time. All we did know was that there had been violent clashes between the mine workers and Lonmin security guards and police. So by the 14th of August, 10 people had died in Marikana. 2 security officers, 2 police officers, and 6 mine workers. And that was when the media arrived in Marikana to assess the situation.
And take us through your assessment. Was it as volatile as we witnessed, as we heard?
It definitely was. It was hostile. The mine workers firstly didn't want journalists, particularly women, to be there. We weren't quite sure about their grievances. We reached out to the unions and they weren't able to give us any answers. The police themselves weren't able to give us any answers. And it was at one particular point that journalists discovered a body in Marikana prior to the 16th of August. It seemed that there was very little information coming from all these different elements, the unions, the mine workers, the police, and we're trying to fit the pieces of the puzzle together until, of course, that fateful day on the 16th of August.
Now, our reporter, Gia Nicolaides, has been in Marikana the last couple of days. We've seen a lot of pictures, Gia, coming out of Marikana, looking pretty abject, if you will. Let's talk about the miners themselves and the sort of lives that they led at the time that would have warranted their desire or their push for this increase to 12,500 rand. Well,
their living conditions were just terrible, Hugo. Many of them were living in shacks just outside of the Lonmin property. Some of them were living within Lonmin's grounds. They were hostels, men's only hostels. But many had opted to live in the shack so that they could live with their families, their wives and their children. But ultimately, I just remember goats feeding off some of the rubbish in the sand roads just outside that informal settlement, Nkaneng, in Marikana. And it was just deplorable in terms of how these people were living. As we later found out, they wanted a living wage. And many of them described to us how the top executives at Lonmin were walking away with millions per year, and they're the ones that were mining the platinum, and they were barely able to feed their families.
Now, NUM was one of the unions involved with the mine workers, and obviously had a responsibility because these mine workers were paying a monthly stipend every month towards some form of protection, facilitation of their grievances. What role did they play in all of this?
Well, the NUM was the dominant union there. And the mine workers felt that their grievances weren't being heard by their own union. And ultimately, many of them actually pulled away from the NUM. When we arrived in Marikana, many of the mine workers said that they weren't part of any union, that they were actually representing themselves. So the question for many of us was, what actually happened? If they wanted an increase in wages, what happened between the NUM and Lonmin management? What happened in that negotiation process to force those mine workers to actually break away from the NUM? And ultimately, what transpired was the formation of a new union, AMCU.
Now, obviously, as a journalist, I'd like to think that you had your fingers firmly on the pulse. Lonmin, were they prepared to speak to the mine workers, or were they not?
Not at that stage, not at all, in fact. And that's all that the mine workers wanted. They wanted a negotiation face-to-face with Lonmin management. And Lonmin management at the time was saying, well, this is an unprotected strike. If you go through the right processes, through your unions, we will address your issues. And the mine workers said, no, we want to speak to Lonmin management. And there were concerns on the police's side, the Lonmin side, saying, well, we've had 10 deaths. There's a violent situation happening here on the ground. But ultimately, I think that that opportunity to engage with the mine workers was lost. Because ultimately, if they could have spoken in some way or form, we may have been able to avoid the 16th of August altogether.
Well, the 10 deaths occurred around about the 14th or prior to that.
Yes.
So there was certainly a window of opportunity. Now, this in many ways speaks to the challenges that a lot of workers are having with their employers. Were we able to establish why Lonmin was not desirous of that conversation? Was it just about them? Was it a bigger picture that they represented?
It could have been a bigger picture in terms of what we saw, what happened afterwards. We saw that Marikana miners were fighting for a higher wage, and that protest action almost spilt over into other mines in and around the Platinum Belt in the northwest. But ultimately, I think that they didn't want to negotiate because there weren't certain processes that were followed, and they wanted to negotiate with the unions and said that those processes had to be followed. But looking back now, you would see that the mine workers weren't happy with their union representatives. So they wanted to have some form of engagement representing themselves. And I still feel, and many journalists who covered the story there in Marikana in 2012, feel that there was a missed opportunity in terms of engaging these workers in a different kind of way. Not taking away that there was a volatile situation on the ground. 10 people had died. And that was the reason why the media was there, because we've covered many protests, many wage grievances across the country in different sectors. The reason we went to Marikana was because we had heard about these brutal deaths, and that's why we actually arrived there.
Now let's talk a little bit about the police, who ironically are the big part of this conversation that we're having today, and the issue of heavy-handedness. And the opportunity, you talk about, there was an opportunity that presented itself for Lonmin management to engage with the miners. Was it not an opportunity that also presented itself to the police when they arrived to carry out some engagement to diffuse what you said was a volatile situation?
Definitely. And I think that the police did do that, in a sense. They did negotiate in the days prior to that shooting. But what happened was that more and more police officers were deployed to Marikana. It first started off with local police, then police provincially from the northwest, and within a few days we had police from all over the country in one place, in Marikana. Can you imagine the tense feeling on the ground when we had hundreds of police officers against around about 3,000 mine workers? I certainly don't think it made the situation any better. And despite their efforts to try and negotiate with the mine workers on a day-to-day basis, what ultimately happened is they came up with a plan to disperse the mine workers, because what the police wanted was for them to put down their nobkiris, their pangas, their weapons, and to stand down. That's what they wanted them to do. And the mine workers said, not until we have the opportunity to speak to Lonmin management.
What then transpired?
Well, ultimately, we then got called to a press briefing by the then Northwest Police Commissioner, Zukiswa Mbombo. And she said, we've come up with a plan. Today is D-Day. We are going to disperse this crowd. And if they do not cooperate, we will do whatever it takes to make sure that they cooperate. So immediately following that press briefing in the boardroom in Lonmin, we went back to the Kopi in Marikana. And that's when it started off. The water cannons, the stun grenades, the rubber bullets, and then the live ammunition.
Now, when you talk about the police commissioner having a plan, multiple uses of force, which obviously ended in the use of live ammunition, Do you get the sense that all of this was indeed part of the plan that was going to end in bloodshed?
It most certainly seemed like it. And only afterwards did we find out that mortuary vans had actually been deployed to Marikana. We didn't know that on the ground at the time. But later, during the Commission of Inquiry, it was discovered that mortuary vans were ordered to come to Marikana, that the number of police officers on the ground with ammunition was sent to Marikana. And the fact that we had this press briefing saying that it's D-Day, today's the day that they have to disperse from the Kopi, made it quite evident that something was going to happen. And looking back, it certainly seemed that they were prepared for bloodshed.
Now, there have been many conversations to date about white monopoly capital. Now, it would seem that there were interests being protected and interests not being protected. The mine workers didn't appear to have anybody protecting them, least of all NUM. The interests, certainly, of the owners of the mine were protected by the police. Does that about sum it right?
Well, it certainly, at the time, looked like Lonmin had the police there to protect the assets of the mine. That's certainly what was evident when we got there. And they had the support from the police minister, Cyril Ramaphosa, a Lonmin shareholder at the time, penned an email and sent it calling for concomitant action to get rid of criminal elements. And most certainly there were criminal elements in Marikana. As we know, those 10 deaths
concomitant action. Take us through, for those that aren't as learned as you, what does that imply or suggest?
Well, it suggests that force must be used. And ultimately, that is what happened. That is why we had so many reinforcements. Can you imagine a situation where there's a protest, and I'd covered many prior to 2012, where police officers from all over the country were deployed to one mining town to disperse a crowd of 3,000. I think some of the university protests that I've covered, there were more protesters, perhaps sometimes more volatile. But ultimately, they called in all reinforcements because this was a massive mining company with international interests. And ultimately, they wanted to bring the situation to an end. I'm sure they wanted to restore calm too. But the mine workers weren't being heard. They certainly weren't being heard. And as you rightly pointed out, who is protecting their interests? They wanted their grievances to be heard by their mining union. And that's ultimately why there was the formation of AMCU, because they felt that they would be better heard through another union.
Gia, let's go back again to that day and from when the police started to use force. Now, from all that I've seen where water cannons are used, they're extremely powerful tools or weapons and will stop many a mass crowd dead in its tracks. Was there enough use of force before a deadly force, in your observation and opinion?
Well, I think that water cannons, yes, you're right, it definitely can stop protesters. It didn't in this instance. Could the water cannons have been used more extensively? Absolutely. Could the stun grenades been used more extensively? Absolutely. I just felt that being on the ground at the time, it happened in such quick concession. It was water cannons, stun grenades, rubber bullets. I didn't even realize at the time that they had gone from rubber bullets to live ammunition because it happened so quickly. I still believe that if they had used the rubber bullets and the water cannon stun grenades for a longer period of time, it may have helped. That being said, the police officers on the ground were also very fearful when they saw this crowd moving towards them. So there are all sides of the story here. But ultimately what happened shouldn't have happened in such a way. And I felt that it just happened in such a short period of time that we moved from we're going to disperse them to live ammunition.
Now let's take a shift away from the miners a little bit and talk about your experience as a journalist. being there on the day, prior to observing what you saw, interface with the miners, and even though they initially were not prepared to talk to you, so obviously some form of relationship building, and then seeing many of those individuals, in fact a total number of 34, lying dead in pools of blood, shot in the back. What are the emotions that you went through and some of the trauma that you've had to contend with?
It was definitely a very traumatic experience, and as I've said, I've covered many protests prior to and after Marikana, and there hasn't been quite an incident like that in my life, personally. Ultimately, I think at the moment I was telling the story as a journalist, so I was trying to gather as much information as I could at the time. Most of the journalists, almost actually all of us, were at scene one, where you actually see those visuals on the television screens at the time, and now, of course. We didn't know what happened at scene two, where some of those miners were shot in the back. We weren't aware of that whatsoever. I remember when those mine workers actually fell to the ground, and I wasn't sure yet that they had been killed, that some of us were walking around and we were counting these bodies. It was evident to me at the time that at least 5 of those mine workers that I saw had passed away. And that is extremely traumatic, I think, for anyone. It doesn't matter what your designation is. And 9 years later, it's just heartbreaking to see that not much has changed for the people in Marikana, or not enough lessons have been learnt since that particular day.